Hello again, you stupendous Goddo people. In this video, we're going to start getting the shooty bits ready. Now, our game is about throwing food, and we're going to get that started with firing projectiles. So we're just going to make a basic template to fire things with, and later on we'll worry about the way projectiles work. Our projectiles are going to be rigid bodies. I want lots of physics. We want things to be pushed out the way. We want things bouncing and ricocheting. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And we're going to have our projectiles randomly selected, but that's coming later. First, let's just get something firing. So I'm going to get into Goddo, and I'm going to make a brand new scene. Let's use a custom node, and I said this is a rigid body, so let's make a rigid body. Now, in this one, we're not going to make any food. I'm just going to make a standard mesh instance. So mesh instance. Remember, Control A to add a node if you don't want to press the plus button. And let's just make it a sphere, nice and easy. And this sphere is probably going to be a bit too big, so let's say a radius of, let's say 0.25. So it's got a diameter of 0.5 meters. So there we go, 50 centimeter diameter or 0.25 centimeter radius. Okay, and we could probably leave that with that material for now. Now, this is a rigid body, it needs a collision shape. So let's add in a collision shape. And this will also be a sphere. And its radius is going to be 0.25 because we want it to fit this. I'm going to save that, create a folder called Projectiles. And I'm going to save this as projectile template. Oops, see what I'm writing. .tscn. And before we go any further, let's actually rename this because I forgot to do that. So projectile template. Awesome. So this is what we're going to be firing. Let's make it actually work. To do that, I'm going to open my player scene. Now, player inherits from character. NPC also inherits from character. So what I want to do is go from player into character because I want the same behavior to happen with both NPCs and players. How the behavior is triggered is going to be different for each. So the character is going to have some default behavior and the player is going to extend that. Now, we've played a lot with inherited scenes. Let's talk a little bit about extended scripts. If I open the player script, you see right at the top here, extends kinematic body. What this means, and you probably know this already, but just as a refresher, what this means is take everything a kinematic body does, everything that's built into a kinematic body, so all of these, if I right-click on it and do open documentation, all of these properties and everything it inherits from, so physics body can access collision object, can access spatial, can access node, can access object. So everything that's in collision object is also in kinematic body. And add in the following. But we can also do this. A character is a kinematic body. So let's add a brand new script called character. And I'm just going to save that. Let's go find it. So I'm going to right click on it, show in file system, and here it is. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to player, and instead of extends kinematic body, I'm going to put this in quotes and just drag that in. It's actually given extra quotes, so I didn't have to add quotes. And now I'm not going to add anything to this script yet. I'm just going to hit play, and you'll notice everything works exactly as it did before, right? So what we've done is I've just changed the player script's default behavior. It's now extending the character. So anything I add to the character script is also going to be accessible by the player and when we write them, the NPCs. This is going to be handy because we're going to have to fire stuff. Speaking of firing stuff, let's make that actually work. So let's put in a keybind. So under project settings, I say keybind. I'm going to use a mouse button. Input map, and let's call this fire. And I'm going to define that as a left mouse button. Boom. Okay, so back in our character, and what I want to do is have a way of loading in the projectile and getting it moving in the right direction. Well, let's go into the 3D scene and figure out a place for it to spawn from. I don't want to spawn from the origin of the player, which is down here on the floor. That's going to be weird. So I'm going to add in a position node. And I'm going to put that 1 meter forward and let's say 2 up. So it's going to be roughly level with the character's head. And I'm doing it on this blue axis here. That's my, what's that called? That's the Z axis. So forward here should be forward there. Now, remember, a position 3D, just like a position 2D, is effectively just a simple spatial node with a different icon. It's just something we can use in the editor to help make things work. I'm going to call this forward. And in my script, I can now access that. So let's start by defining a constant and going into distraction-free mode. And I'm going to call this projectile speed. And let's put that as 50. Okay. We need a function to make things fire. I'm doing this in the character, not in the player, because NPCs also fire. And what I need to do first is define the projectile. So let's make variable projectile. And that's going to be equal to, and I'm coming out of distraction free mode to do this bit. Let's find my projectile, this scene here. So I'm just going to drag that in. And this is a string. That's no good to me. I need to cast that as a file using load. And I need it instance in. So let's use the instance function. Okay. Now at this point, we need to think a little bit about how this works. You see, the projectile needs to move separately from the player. Currently, this is going to add it as a child. We're going to use add child projectile. But that means that whatever the player moves, the projectile will move in relation to that. So if I fire and then move left, the projectile will go forward and left with my character. So I need to make it not do that. And to make that work, I can use a function called set as top level and use true. Set as top level just means put this at the top of the scene tree and don't move it in relation to its parent. That's all it's doing. Okay, now once we've done that, let's move it. It's important, by the way, that I'm adding this to the scene before I set it as top level, otherwise it's going to go weird. So projectile dot global transform. And that's going to be wherever the forward dot global transform is. Now I'm using global transform because we've now moved it to top level, right? So it can't just say transform. I need to know where you are globally in the world. All right, the next thing I need to do is figure out which way is actually forward. We can turn on our y-axis, which means we can face the back of the room. If I face the back of the room, I expect the projectile to go backwards. So I need to find out which way am I actually facing, not just where is the forward node, which way am I facing. To do that, I'm going to make a variable called character forward. And that is going to be the global transform basis. Now, if we look at basis, it's the matrix of its x, y, and z axes. So I want the z axis, which is the third thing, right? So x, y, z. But remember, we're starting from 0. Don't put an off by 1 error in. I'm just treating it as an array. Entry 2, not 0, not 1, but 2. That's my z axis. And I want that normalized. Okay, finally, I need to access the projectile. Now, it's a rigid body, which means it has access to linear velocity. What we don't want to do is use move this much every frame. This is a rigid body, so we're going to actually give it an impulse. We're going to give it an actual speed and let it calculate. The linear velocity, oops, that's not HasteBot projectile. That's HasteBot projectile, is equal to the character forward multiplied by the projectile speed. Okay, this should work once that command is done, but when is that command going to happen? Well, let's go back to our player script, and under input, right here, I'm going to say if the input dot is action just pressed, there it is, and I want the fire action. So what's going to happen? I'm going to run fire. And that should work. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, Jan, you haven't put fire as a function in the player. You're right, I haven't. But remember, we're extending the character scene. So if it exists in the character scene, it's accessible here. Let's find out if that's true. Look at that. We now have little, well, effectively ping pong balls, right? Now, there is a bit of an issue here, which is I can very quickly fill this level. It's going to take me quite a long time to get any appreciable slowdown here. But what I'd like to do is get these to vanish after a little while. So that's going to be my challenge to you. I would like you to have the food vanish after a set amount of time. Let's say, I don't know, 5 seconds. Listen to your heart. Pick an amount of time you want. There's a couple of ways you could do this. So pause the video, give that a shot, and when you come back, I'll show you my solution. And welcome back. Okay, how could we do this? Well, there's a couple of things we could do. I'm going to go to my projectile, and the first thing we could do is we could add a timer, which is probably the solution I would use. I'm just going to add it to 5 seconds, and then connect it to a signal. But we don't have to do it that way. You could also add an animation. We can make an animation player and add in a brand new animation called despawn or something like that. We could autoplay it, which is this button, and make it last for 5 seconds. And then at the 5-second mark, we could add in a new method track running from projectile template, insert a key, and we'll say cue free, which is right there. These will both work. I'm going to leave cue free in for now. Normally, I would use a timer just because it feels easier to me. But if you don't want running signals and all the rest of it, this should work fine. Let's make sure I'm actually telling the truth there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Haha! They'll both work just fine. So if you want to use an animation player, use an animation player. If you want to use a timer with a signal, use a timer with a signal. What we have here is a very simple firing system. Now, because this is in relation to the player and not the camera, looking up doesn't change the angle. I'm happy with that. That's the behavior I want. It might not be the behavior you want, in which case you'd have to make this work on the camera, not on the player. But for the purposes of how I want this game to feel, this feels pretty good for me, which means this is a good place to stop this video. In this video, we've looked at how to fire projectiles in the direction the player is facing. We've got a basic framework going, and we're ready to start making this awesome with lots of delicious looking food. So, excellent work, and I'll see you in the next video.